Quand au bout de 8 jours, leur peau terminée, on va reprendre les tranchées. Notre place est si utile que sans nous on prend la pile. Mais c'est bien fini, on en a assez, personne ne veut plus marcher.
I'm sorry that I do not speak French, so I speak in English. I understand that the translation of my lecture is being handed in to you, so you can follow more easily. And I'll try to do my best and stay close to the text. But before I start with what you have in your hands, I'll just say 3 general words that this conference was very interesting in the opportunity to get a context of refusal and refusing to serve the army and refusing for the war in different places and different times in history. I will also try to give you a context of the Israeli case of refusal, to give you a little of the historical context. But this is the new history that I'm talking about. The refusal movement in Israel is, let's say, the last 15 years are the top of the Israeli refusal movement. So actually we're talking about refusal in present tense. It is something that is happening right now. And therefore the questions that we are dealing with are not questions of history, but questions of prospect. What we want to achieve, what we want to change, and how do we use refusal to change reality. So this is the context in which I look at what I'm talking about. I believe that the struggle for anti-militarization is never to be separated from the struggle for freedom, democracy, and equality. Oppression, violence, and exploitation have many faces, and the rejection of military solutions is but one, to move to the right direction. It is not connected to the other subjects. If it's not connected to the other subject, if we look at anti-militarization without the context, without the political context, then we are even in a danger of strengthening the wrong side. Why is it important for me to say? In the Israeli-Palestinian context, there is an oppressor and an oppressed side. And when you talk about violence or militant struggle, then military struggle, then there's a very big difference between the legitimation of the occupation and the legitimation of the struggle against occupation. You cannot actually talk about anti-militarization generally because it is not the same thing, and you need to look at it from the question of the power relations of the different sides. The historical context is this. I guess most of you know, but I will give you this because I think that it's important to be on the same page. So you know that Israel was established 67 years ago as a remedy for the crimes against the Jews in Europe, for the Holocaust. And Israel has served as an asylum and a new home for the Jews that survived the Second World War, and the Jews who were in different countries that somehow were swept into this Zionist project. The solution to the Jewish problem was done over a land that was not empty. There were native inhabitants of the land, the Palestinians, and they were not taking into account. When the world said to the Jews, "Here, I have a solution for you," he didn't look twice at the people who actually lived in this land. The Palestinians were, and till this day, they are uprooted, deported, living in refugee camps, under military regime, or in the occupied territories, or as second-class citizens inside Israel. Well, I said a lot of things, so just to clear the head, there are several groups. The Palestinian people actually have been divided. So there's 1 million of Palestinians inside Israel, second-class citizens, and they're Palestinians, but they're citizens. There's another group of Palestinians who live in the West Bank and Gaza, the occupied territories. They live under military occupation, direct military occupation. My friends who go to the army are sent to be the direct occupiers of the Palestinians. In Gaza, there's a siege. Gaza is like a ghetto. It's closed from all directions. Nothing can go out and in. And around Israel, and all the neighbor countries, there are refugee camps for the Palestinians that were deported in 1948, and till this day, never found a new home. So this is actually the context in which we go to the army. So of course, army is always problematic, but the problematization of the army is different between place and place. In Israel, there is conscription. Okay, we have to go to the army. It's not a choice. The law demands that every one of us goes to the army. But what do I mean by every one of us, every Israeli? If I said earlier that we have a fifth of our population who is Arab and Palestinian, so not every Israeli has to go to the army. Every Jew has to go to the army. And among the Arabs, what the Israeli army does is dividing the Arab citizens by different groups. There are different sects, different religions. So the Druze have to serve in the army. The Bedouins and the Christians are requested, to volunteer to the army. And the poor ones actually go. Usually you can see that the weaker classes of the Palestinians, the Christians and the Bedouins especially, go to the army, volunteer to the army actually. The Muslims don't go to the army almost at all. And also among the Jews. I know that you talk a lot about this connection between religion and army. But in Israel it is more complicated because the Orthodox Jews don't serve in the army. The Orthodox Jews never serve in any army in any state in the world. They always refuse to serve, and they sit and study all day the Bible, the Torah. They don't go and fight. But in Israel, it's not very easy because they're Jewish. They're supposed to serve. It's a racial, religious regime. But the Orthodox, they say that their life revolves around religious studies and community life, and they believe that their study is the important project that preserves the Jewish people. So how can the Jewish state go against the Jewish people? It's very complicated. In 1948, when Israel was just established, the Haredi, the Orthodox community, put the demand to the Zionist movement. If you want the religious people to cooperate with your Zionist dream, you need to give us your promise that our sons will be able to go and study in the yeshiva, study religious studies, and not go to the army. And this was the status quo agreement signed in 1948. This agreement is being challenged the last years, time and time again. And there are bigger and bigger struggles of the Orthodox religion, the religious people, against the army that tries to recruit their sons and take them to the army. This is, I guess, history that you don't know. Today, us, the leftist refusers, we cooperate with the Orthodox because we are both in the same side, the people who don't believe in the military service in Israel. As for us, the seculars, we are the majority in Israel. In the past, it wasn't imaginable to think of refusal. There weren't many people who thought of objecting this absolute truth that of Israel has a necessity to fight for its existence. It was obvious, not anything that anyone could question. So that's why everyone needs to serve in the army. This is our lives, our existence. Israel was and still is in a constant state of war and terror. The brainwash around it is massive, because it's true that we are under terror, but the power relations are very, very clear inside this war. And what keeps the war going is the fact that we keep going to the army, and we keep going and oppressing our neighbors. So, in one hand, how can you not go to war when you're in constant state of terror and threat? But on the other hand, how can you end the terror and threat if you keep going and occupying your neighbors? That's the paradox that we live in. In the past, even the radical anarchists and the communists, they all served in the army. It wasn't even a question. Maybe there was once in every decade that someone who said, I'm a pacifist. I don't believe in any war. And then they were very famous, they sat in jail. But it was really once every 10 years, maybe. They sat in jail for refusing for the military service, and their names were very famous in Israel. The change has started in the 80s. In the 80s, there was the first Lebanon War. The first Lebanon War was the first war in Israel that had no consensus. It seemed very arbitrary. Israel just went and occupied Lebanon, and Lebanon has enough problems of its own, as you know. And a lot of people criticized this war and didn't feel comfortable with the fact that not only the young people, but also the older people go to the reserve forces and have to fight on foreign land. And then I'll say another thing about the 80s. So the 80s started in Israel with the Lebanon War and continued with the first Intifada. The first Intifada was the first wave of resistance among the Palestinians in the West, in the occupied territories. The Palestinians in the occupied territories started fighting with stones against tanks. They were running with children with stones against tanks. And the Israeli soldiers who were sent to oppress this resistance, many of them felt that there is a problem with the situation. When you go with guns against children with stones, the question of legitimation has to rise. And these unnecessary wars, with no absolute consensus, opened the possibility of refusing to serve in the army to be not a personal matter of this pacifist or that pacifist, but being a political matter of a group that wants to stop this war. A first group called Yesh Gvul, There's a Limit, that's a translation of their name, has started the public campaign for refusing to serve the war and occupation. Not refusing to serve in the army altogether. They weren't pacifists. They said, we are for military service, but only for the justified reasons, only for defense. So if you send us to the occupied territories, we refuse. If you send us to Lebanon, we refuse. They wanted to draw the line between legitimate defense and what was pure aggression and occupation. During the 90s, this wave has kind of vanished. They still exist. There's a limit group. They still exist till today. But during the 90s, Israel thought itself to be in a peace process. And during the peace process, also the army stopped going to Lebanon, and the Intifada ceased to happen, and things kind of calmed down. So there were personal people, refusers, who didn't want to go and serve the occupation, because the occupation was ongoing. The peace process was only in the media, in the news. In everyday life, you didn't see any peace process. Vice versa. Actually, the Oslo agreements, I don't know how well known it is here in France, but during the peace process, Israel has started with a checkpoint regime. Before the 90s, there were no checkpoints everywhere. The Palestinians could just go in and out of Israel as they wanted. But during the 90s and during the peace process, Israel has put checkpoints not only between the Palestinian territories and Israel, but also inside the Palestinian territories, between every village and village, every town and every city. So during the 90s, the peace process and the brave combats, the soldiers went back to their service. And there was a stream of lonely pacifists who sat in jail alone, with no support or movement. I am the generation of the second Intifada. We called them the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs. They were, each one of them, alone, one lonely refuser with no movement to support him. My wave, we started around 2001 during the second Intifada, during the uprising of the Palestinians against the constant occupation of their lands. We were teenagers. We were already activists against the occupation and colonialism. Some of us, like me, were part of the Democratic Front for Peace and Equality, Hadash. It's a Jewish Arab socialist party that has the Communist Party as a part of it. We all thought that there's no chance we're going to serve the occupation army after demonstrating against it for so long. So a small group of us, teenagers, really we were high school students, met and wrote a letter to the Prime Minister saying that we are about to refuse to enlist to the army because of the occupation. This was called the refusal letter. The publication of that letter struck hard in the heart of the Israeli mainstream. It was shocking. We were only 62 at first, 350 after the publication. And both the local and the international media was all over us. We had to run media workshops immediately, just to be able to handle the wave of public interest we were not so ready for. The media and the public mainly cursed us and blamed us for being traitors and a danger to the Israeli security. But the message was out. And the option for a teenager to see the possibility of refusing opened up. More and more teenagers were looking for their way out of the army. Several months after us, another letter was thrown into the Israeli media, a letter of high-rank officers in reserve forces who refused to continue and take part in the military occupation of the Palestinian people, but not refuse the military service altogether. Closely after that came many other refusal letters of specific military units. The military pilots were well remembered for being mentioned as later on as one of the reasons for Ariel Sharon's decision to disengage from Gaza Strip. He said that he figured out that soon he won't have enough high-quality soldiers to sustain the military occupation of Gaza. Arik Sharon, okay? So a siege demanded much less forces than an actual occupation of the population itself. So just to make it clear, we were young teenagers, refusers who refused to military service altogether. But after us came the adults, the high-rank officers, the reserve forces, who say that we don't want to serve the occupation, not all the army. So this was the beginning of the period of the more or less organized refusal and anti-militarist struggle in Israel, from our side at least. But, as I said before, the Jews are not the whole story. The Palestinians in Israel, the Arab citizens, are also part of the story. Parallel to us, the Druze minority, which I have mentioned before, started calling for refusal in the 80s. The refusal is sometimes slightly different, as it contains not only the rejection of the armed oppression, but also the idea that they are Palestinians and they are Arabs, the Jews. And the Israeli army is recruiting them to fight for the Jews against their own. During the last 15 years, There have been many refusal groups, letters, and organizations in the Jewish Israeli secular public. In 2005, 2008, 2009, 2014, we had teenage groups who wrote public and political refusal letters. They were followed by more groups of reserve soldiers who imitated their move and got their message deeper into the Israeli consciousness. In Israel, the voice of an army veteran, possibly a war hero, always gets more legitimacy. So when the young people refuse, people say, it's traitors. But when a high-rank general says, okay, this occupation is too much, then people listen to him. This is why we need each other. An anti-militarist movement called New Profile has also begun to work. They shifted the focus from political refusal only to serve a more general stand in support of all avoidance of military service, whether the reasons are ideological or not, personal. Many arguments torn the small refusal movements apart. We have refusers that say, Zionism, are you pro or con? Selective refusal versus complete refusal. Selective meaning I serve the army, but not the occupied territories. Total refusal says, I'm not serving this army. This is an occupation army. This is the kind of argument that we have within the movement. Public acts versus private support. Okay? Do you want to go public with your refusal and say publicly, I object the army and the army has to stop? Or, no, I'm just trying to help the people who avoid the military service. There were feminist criticism of the adoration of the jailed refuser, who were usually men only, because the army doesn't put in jail so many women. And identity politics criticism against the racial and social economic profile of the ideologic refusers who sit in prison for their acts. I want to continue a little about this point of who are these people who refuse? Who are these conscientious objectors? This is an interesting point. 15 years ago, the ideological movement of refusal was very white and upper class. The last generation during the generations of refusal, it got wider. And the refusers are different. The conscience prisoners of last year, I'm talking about last year, 2014. They were from all parts of society and all areas of the country. We had two religious anti-occupation refusers, many Mizrahi Sephardi. I don't know if you know what Sephardi means. Like the Jews in Israel are generally divided into two groups: the European Jews and the Jews who come from the Arab countries or the Muslim countries. Ashkenazi and Sephardi. Ashkenazi and Sephardi. So so we had many Sephardi activists, and we even had a refuser who grew up in an illegal settlement in the West Bank. So he was a colonialist in the West Bank, and he refused to serve the occupation when he grew up. In the last 2 years, so what I'm saying is that actually today, this profile of upper class is broken. Everyone, the refusal comes from all different kinds of parts of the Israeli society. In the last 2 years, I have taken upon myself to guide and consult the young refusal movement. It started when five of them approached a friend of mine in a summer camp and said that they want to start a new refusal letter. And he passed them on to me. I met with them for half a year until they had a political text that they agree upon. And a primal group of around 150 young high school students around them. And we went public, we went to the media. These guys and girls were very brave. They were the ones who held the demonstrations against the last war in Gaza, when the whole Israeli public and the Israeli left was paralyzed from this terrible war that happened last summer. And 6 of them sat in jail for around half a year, each one. And they held seminars, demonstrations, and press releases all the time against the war. They were actually the hope, I think, of the Israeli left, these young and full of hope and courage teenagers. Shortly after their publication, in March 2014, 3 other reserve refusal letters have turned to us to ask for help and guidance. Reserve forces, again, I mean the older people who served in the army many years ago, the high rank officers. The Reserve Forces letter on August 2014, a letter of refusal of 50 of the science and arts, 50 former students of arts and sciences high school. They called for the students to go after them and refuse. A very famous and elite high school who called the present pupils of the school to refuse to enlist. And the most famous letter was the 8200 letter. 8200 is the name of the intelligence unit in the Israeli army. So it was a letter of reserve soldiers of the top intelligence units in the IDF, the Israeli army, who refused to continue serving and also published the terrible stories of what the unit is doing. The most famous point was that they use intelligence on homosexual Palestinians to blackmail them into cooperation and giving up information about their relatives, friends, and co-workers and the like. This was very shocking for the Israeli public because intelligence sounds neutral, and actually they showed the public what crimes they're involved in. Me and other friends of my refusal letter of 2002, we were helping them with the coordination, political advice, media work, and networking with other activists to make the group big enough to get public attention. So, as you can see, our work in Israel is very, very politicized. The army in Israel is a sacred cow, we say. It's a sacred cow. Yeah, a taboo. And anyone who speaks against it knows she takes herself outside the warm hug of consensus and might very well be publicly attacked for her opinions. Shaming and incitement toward us are very frequent. And as a guide to teenagers, I have to prepare both the teenagers and their parents not only to jail, but also to public shaming. It's not easy. I myself had a traitor poster with my face on it, shared on Facebook 10,000 times. Lately, we've started out a new framework for activity. It's called Mesarvot, refusing, and it's a new network for the support and campaigning for public ideological refusal alone, so that a stable base for support will help to hold the permanent wave of refusal in the last 15 years. It was always very personal. Somebody refuses and we support. Now we want a real organized movement only for the public effect to increase the public effect of these acts. We don't want it to be dependent on the availability of few past refusers who can support and guide the new refusers, who always come with full energy and no knowledge and skills that would help them make their way and make their public statement of refusal effective. This is what we see as our goal. Our goal to use refusal as a way to protest against the ongoing occupation and aggression of our government against the Palestinian people, the Arab countries which surround us, and eventually against ourselves, because we believe that the army actually sustains the circle of blood and violence in its acts. We believe that only peace will bring us security, and for that, the continuing military aggression and occupation must become impossible. How do you make it impossible? Israel is strong. So, making it impossible demands many things together, and I'll say them. We need all kinds of pressure. Pressure from the citizens of Israel, from the refusal movement, the peace movement, from the Palestinian minority in Israel, from the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza themselves. Yes, we need their resistance. And of course, the international pressure is also needed. Therefore, many of us welcome the boycott initiatives and all sorts of political pressure on our government. In the end of the day, our government is dependent of the international support it receives from both diplomatic, financial, and military support of the strong countries in the West. Sometimes it is official, sometimes it is not official, and they just help us by selling, by selling the arms and buying arms from us. The security business in Israel is very strong. So we need your support, and we need to strengthen this voice of refusal if we want to solve this problem which is killing us. And people tell me here that it also has an effect on you. People tell me that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict helps to incite more violence and more distrust, also in Europe and in other places in the world, between Arabs and the West. And in this way, we really need to think of the army as a problem and not as the solution. An army is a tool, an instrument. When it's uses for liberation, that's one thing. When it is used for oppression and aggression, then more oppression and more aggression will come after. Thank you very much.